Hello, and welcome back to season 2 of our Men Can Stop Rape National Healthy Masculinity Conversation Series. My name is Adam Middleton. I'm the digital director at MCSR. I'll be your moderator today, and we've got a good one in store. We're excited to have you in on a conversation about the perception of healthy masculinities and gender norms from participants in college men's engagement programs. It's titled, Maybe I Was Taught Wrong All Along, Then Again. To help drive this conversation and showcase really what inspired it, we're thrilled to welcome two authors of some research recently presented at the Society for Social Work and Research. They are Dr. Juliana Carlson and Dr. Dustin Struble from the University of Kansas. I say a warm welcome to Dr. Carlson, who's joining us for the first time, and welcome back to Dr. Struble, who 3 years ago joined us for our Healthy Masculinity Training Institute here in DC. We're also very lucky to have Breland Thomas, Senior Program and Technical Assistance Manager here at MCSR, and Dan Glover, our Youth Development and Training and Technical Assistance Program Manager. So how's everybody doing? Can I ask for a one-word check-in from each of you? Tell me either how you're feeling or what you'd like to bring into the conversation today. Let me start with Dan.
Thanks, Adam. My word would be curious.
Okay. Juliana?
I am very intrigued to hear our responses to this conversation.
Breland?
My word would be inquisitive.
And Dustin?
Excited. Excited to share this information that Juliana and I have been able to kind of pour over the last couple of years.
I'm sure of it. Very, very good. So before we get started, in case those of you tuned in don't know, this is a two-part conversation. That's right, a lot of good stuff coming your way. So next week, Dr. Struble will be back with us live and joined by his colleague, Anthony Boynton, for a deeper dive into how scholarship, evaluation, and assessment can influence healthy masculinity engagement programs for men and masculine folks. So the same kinds of programs we'll be discussing today. We hope you'll be able to join us on Monday at 2:30 Eastern live. We'll be taking your questions, and those can be submitted either in the YouTube chat or on Twitter using hashtag MCSR series. And we're just really excited and grateful to have so much of our colleagues from the university's time to explore the incredible work that they're doing. So as I like to say, and now let's get started and jump into today's conversation. Rigid masculine gender norms have been identified as a significant driver of sexual violence. To prevent and reduce sexual violence perpetration, some colleges and universities have developed men's engagement programs intended to educate college men about how they address masculine gender norms that contribute to rape culture and gender-based violence. These men's engagement programs range from being inserted into athletics-based teams to standalone programs that rely on self-selection. However, little is known about these programs, including participants' gender norms after completing the program. So this research team, Dr. Struble, Dr. Carlson, and their colleagues, Dr. Natabhona Mabachi and Dr. Alesha Doan, worked with a group of Midwestern colleges and universities to develop men's programs. They intended to engage participants in critical inquiry to recognize harmful masculine gender norms and to identify ways to promote gender equity. As the title of today's conversation suggests, this study then examined the perceptions of masculinities and masculine gender norms of students who participated in men's engagement programs. So Dustin and Juliana, whoever would like to go first, set the context for us. Either tell us a little bit about yourselves and what inspired this research project. And is there anything you'd add to how the project was just described?
Thanks so much, Adam. It's lovely to be here with you all and really excited to talk about the work that we did together as a team. I want to kind of set the stage for this conversation and thinking about what happens on college campuses, and to name that the issue of sexual violence on college campuses is not new for us. It's something that we know exists, and it is something that I think college campuses have been trying to understand. How do we work together to try to prevent it from happening to our students and sometimes between our students. In 2016, we had an opportunity to apply for funding from the Office of Women's Health, which is a federal agency within our government, to be able to really focus in on prevention and policy work related to preventing campus sexual violence. Prior to that opportunity, Dustin and I and several other people on the University of Kansas campus were really focusing in on the prevention of sexual violence. And that was driven particularly by thinking about the principles of prevention, which is scholarship that was based on looking at lots of different types of prevention and thinking about if we're going to do really effective, comprehensive prevention, it needs to be informed by evidence, right? To be able to make that change happen. And this connects with our development of these engaging men's programs in saying that really we're not going to see attitudinal and behavior change around sexual violence if we're doing one-time conversations, one-off conversations. We know that we need to have sufficient dosage is the term that's used. I think we can, relate to that right now with our vaccinations with COVID, right? It isn't just sometimes a one-time thing. We really need to think about effective vaccination around this. And so our men's engagement work that we invested in was really thinking this can't be one-time conversations. This really needs to be more of a programmatic approach, meaning we need to have men and masculine folks being engaged regularly with each other to be able to have deep conversations about what are our understanding or what are our ideas about masculinity. So that opportunity in 2016 for that grant funding allowed our research team to really dig in and get connected with, as we've identified, 8 college campuses within Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. We named that project the Heartland Project because we are in the Heartland. Interestingly, just for people who are interested in this, we've seen a lot of activity on the coasts of the United States around kind of innovative college campus related work. We have not seen as much effort within the middle of the country. And I think we had a great opportunity to be able to really connect with these college campuses, some that were very large, university campuses, ours included, and some that were very small, commuter colleges, private colleges, and also faith-based universities. So we worked together for about 3 years, invested in that work. And the study that we're going to focus on today, thank you for inviting us to talk about, is focused on the work that we did with 4 of those campuses. And I'll share, and Dustin and I will share more about that as we move forward.
Very good. So let's talk about those 4 campuses, and in addition to setting the context. Could you tell us, did they all already exist when you began this project? Were they all new, or was there a hybrid?
That's a great question, Adam. What I would say is only one had a program that was already invested. And guess what? That was KU, the University of Kansas. And we definitely leaned on the fact that we had seen something happen on campus to be able to know that it was possible. And I really want to credit Dustin as our lead champion of that work at KU's campus. And that is located within our Sexual Assault Prevention and Education Center, which is a super amazing organization within our university. So yeah, the other 3 we helped to support to the point that they had created these programs. We did that by offering both curriculum that they could look at that had been developed at other campuses. We didn't tell the campuses, you have to do it this way, but we gave them an opportunity to review those. We had a lot of TA provision to them to be able to think through how would they do it, who were ideal facilitators of those spaces, which is a really important part of this work. We helped them try to strategize about, if they felt like they couldn't do 12 sessions, which was, kind of considered ideal for us within a semester. how many could they do? Did they feel like they could do 5 or 4? So really trying to address the issue around capacity, which is a challenge on college campuses always of sometimes you have units that are assigned to like do everything around sexual violence, both response to it and prevention. And that means that they're getting pulled in a lot of different directions, number one, and how supportive universities are to create these kind of programs. So one of the things, as we identified, we worked with 8 campuses, but only 4 of them to the point that we were able to do these focus groups with the men that participated. It's hard. It's not easy work, and trying to figure out how to both engage people who can facilitate these groups and have the skill to be able to do that, and be able to figure out ways to engage men in that process is not easy. And so we were really happy with the fact that we had half of our campuses that were able to do that work.
And with all that went into it, the preparation, comparison, TA, of the 4, did they largely end up on the same curriculum? Did you mentioned dosage? Did everyone get to 12 weeks, or how were they similar? How did they differ?
Yeah. Number one that is interesting about the 4 is they ranged in a bunch of different ways. One was some of them were located within athletic programs. So that is a unique group. And we'll talk about this a little bit with our findings. If you've got a coach who says, we're going to do this program, it's going to happen differently than if you've got other approaches that we had where we had men that were nominated. And so they had someone within their community to say, this is a person that should attend this group. We also had groups that were men that were interested in attending. So that I think is another variable to kind of consider, like again, what I was saying about sort of the capacity or the readiness for a university to have that. It depends on that institutional support, and that institutional can be, like I said, the champion of having a coach say, this is what we're doing. So at one of our college campuses, the entire football team was engaged in these conversations. That looked very, very different than, for example, at other campuses where it was like 10 men together in a room. When you have an entire football team, that is a lot of men all together, and their coaches were present. So that looks different. You asked also about numbers of meetings. I would say the fewest would be 4 times that the men met, and up to, for some groups, I'm thinking about like for the football team, maybe 15 would kind of be max. So, on average, people are meeting 7 to 10 times, which is, from a group kind of change process is a pretty good amount of time. Usually an hour to an hour and a half of meeting time. I feel like I might be missing something about questions that you added. Did you want to add any more?
Yeah, well, I think what you just said, speaks to the fact that of the 4, you all mentioned having everything from large public to small private.
Yes.
So with all that variety just comes variables. I'm curious to kind of bookend the question at the end, did they all have the same curriculum?
Right. Thank you, Adam. No, they did not. And one of the things that Dustin and I and others have been kind of thinking about is, is there a curriculum that we might want to advance? I think as a group of people who are really interested in this work. I'm going to give you a little taste of what next week, what you're going to hear from Dustin and Anthony. As a fan of the work that's going on at KU, I think that the work that they've been doing around the Men's Action Program is awesome and very, very thoughtful. And not all curriculum are like that. And I think that Dustin and Anthony and others who are helping to inform that, me being one of the people, is really helping to think that through of, it's not just masculinity is the conversation. It's also thinking about how does racism impact our understanding and experience of masculinity. It's also thinking about, bodies in relationship to masculinity and sexuality and lots of things that I think make those conversations deeper and richer. So that's just a little, come hear Dustin and Anthony talk next week, because it's pretty rad.
Yes, absolutely. We are looking forward to that and all things Men's Action Project next week. The title of the study, or the poster that was presented, looks at masculinities and gender norms. But of course, our work at Men Can Stop Rape, and the name of this series does take a look at healthy masculinity specifically. And can I ask, what role did healthy masculinity have, if any, in your research purpose?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually was just talking about this with my husband during lunch. I really like that Men Can Stop Rape conceptualizes this idea of healthy masculinity. And this is why I'm excited about this conversation, because I think, what does that mean is a great question for all of us, and is a conversation, right? I think I loved that some of our words to begin the call today are curiosity. We're intrigued. We're trying to understand this. And I think in my work, which is focused very, very primarily on the prevention of gender-based violence and thinking about how to engage men and masculine folk in that work, understanding what does healthy masculinity mean to me is a conversation. And I don't know if it is helpful always for us to say, this is it. I think we need to keep asking ourselves, what is it? And to be in constant inquiry about that. I will say for myself that as we understand more fully how complex we are as humans, that we sometimes don't identify as femme, masculine, but that we also identify as gender non-binary, as trans, that we think about gender, we're thinking about gender and naming gender as more complex. And I think that goes along with, for me, around thinking about healthy masculinity. I think we need to be open to having conversations that might make us uncomfortable about what we think it means and what we don't think it means. And I, as a white woman, I also want to name that I think that with having those conversations within the white supremacy culture that we live in, it is important for us to make sure who is saying what healthy masculinity is or not. So that's what that would be my answer. I sound like an academic. I'm not going to answer it. It is, but I want to engage people, right? That's part of our scholarship is to say, what is it? And to listen to men and masculine folk tell us what they believe that it is, and to be involved in that process of interrogating how we think we've defined it. I would end with saying, for me, I want us all to think about gender equity and think about that also within a complicated lens of that it isn't a binary. But how do we relate to each other in caring ways, in ways that are justice oriented? So that would be where I would head in that conversation, is using those lenses of equity and justice. But what that really looks like for men and masculine folk, I leave that to you all to help us think that through, and to the other people that we're talking with.
I certainly appreciate your point about making it a conversation and also identifying intersections of gender, race, class. At Men Can Stop Rape for 25 years, we've been committed to creating cultures free from violence. But we also ask ourselves the question of, what are we creating cultures of? And that's,
Yes.
equity, justice, love, and respect. And so I think when we talk about healthy masculinity, you have to have a conversation with all those contexts to continue arriving at what may feel like an answer, but is ultimately a conversation.
Yeah, no, I love that you added love and respect, and I would also add joy. And I just think when we're thinking about acts of resistance, acts of solidarity in pushing back against status quo in lots of different ways, the importance of joy in that work as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the study at hand, let's get into the study. What do you think, 3 years of work and still ongoing, what would you say at this moment are some of the most important research findings?
Well, I'd say even with 3 years of reviewing this and looking at all the rich data that we got, it still feels like we're really just scratching the surface with this. When we started out, I think Juliana and I were very ambitious with all the different questions that we organized for these interviews, and admittedly, there's still actually much more that can come from this research beyond just talking about how students make sense of masculinities and specifically healthy masculinities. There are areas of inquiry around how do men define accountability, and how do men enact accountability within themselves, their friends, their communities, things like that, that we really hope to explore further. But I think that even while there was some consistency in the curriculum and format of some of these courses, our students really arrive at different places when it comes to making sense of what both unhealthy masculinities and healthy masculinities mean to them. I think it was for someone who's been doing this work for a while, it was really interesting to see the ease at which students access concepts like the man box to talk about traditional masculinities, hegemonic masculinities, and at times to use that as a way of making sense of how masculinities can be, under certain circumstances, unhealthy, right? And yet, as we started to look at how they make sense and define healthy masculinities, there was not unanimity among our participants about what that really looked like. That really gave us a sense that, okay, like, even though these folks are going through this experience, there still is space within these more dialogue-based programs for students to make sense of what that means for them. And that for some, that there was that heightened level of really going beyond healthy masculinity to this concept of masculinities, where it's this idea about how their masculine identities do interact or intersect with other identities that they make sense of, whether it be because of the social identities that they hold or because the programs themselves potentially created space for them to explore some of these concepts as they relate to other systems of oppression or other concepts around privileged identities and things of the like.
It's interesting. My next question was going to be, how do these findings connect to healthy masculinity? It sounds like what's starting to emerge is that, a big piece of it is a bit of a personal definition or an individual definition. Would it be too forward to say that, these kinds of programs, based on your findings so far, could create some level of a baseline as it relates to understanding healthy masculinities?
I think yes, in a sense of approach. Can we create an approach within these programs in which men together can come together to define what they deem as unhealthy, or as some might refer to as toxic? I know in my experience, when I have these conversations, if we're going to use terminology like toxic, what does it mean, and to whom is it toxic? But really, like, what are the things that make something unhealthy masculine? And create the space to really explore what those sets of attitudes, norms, and beliefs are, interrogate those, understand why they are the way they are, and then to create a space. And this is kind of using a gender transformative lens, or gender transformative approach, but we can't just tell folks what's wrong, right? We can't just tell folks what's unhealthy or toxic, but we actually have to create a space and provide them with the base knowledge so that they can kind of forge for themselves what healthy masculinities might look like in its place, right? Trying to think about this in terms of a transformative, and in the sense that we don't necessarily have the answer of what healthy masculinities are, but we can give you the tools to help make sense of what healthy masculinities mean to you as an individual and what it means to you within your social interactions with other folks.
That's right. And again, this is a conversation series for those of you tuning in. Hashtag MCSR series. We want to hear your thoughts and questions that you might want to bring into next week's session when we have Dustin back and we're talking all about the Men's Action Project. So, tell us what you think. This is meant to be informative and discussive. And so we welcome you into the space. So a lot of data, a lot of students, a lot of campuses of different sizes and different types. What challenges did you run into in collecting the research for the 4 programs, and how did you deal with those challenges?
It's a great question. And I totally wanted, when Dustin was talking, I wanted to read a quote from one of our participants, if that would be okay, Adam, because it relates to what you all were talking about. And you mentioned part of it in our opening. So this is related to that idea of us asking the men both, how do you describe healthy masculinity? And then what would you describe as unhealthy masculinity? And one person in the focus group said, one man in the focus group said, I didn't even realize that all the stuff we were taught when we were young, I just took it in and just thought it was the norm, like what my dad used to tell me and stuff like that. And I guess some of it could be abuse. But you don't really think about that because the people you looked up to when you were young were always right. They were older than you. But now getting to this age and thinking back to what they had to say, it makes you think, maybe I was taught wrong all along. But then again, I don't know if I would be where I am today without it. And I think that quote, I always love, as a qualitative researcher, I always love to make sure we're pulling in the actual words of our participant. It's helped to me to honor their voices. You hear the tension, right? Of like, I absorbed all of this information about what it means to be a man. And the people that taught me that, they were my elders and I took it, right? And now I'm thinking, is that wrong? And recognizing I benefited from the way that I was taught. And that gets more complicated, right? As we talk about like, what does that really mean to benefit? Sometimes it's actually real things that, concrete things that you can benefit from. The athletes knowing that they worked really hard at being an athlete and getting recognition for doing that, and recognizing the costs as well, sometimes associated with that. Dustin named the man box, which was often a framing that people used to be able to talk about that work, that was both limiting, right? And that sometimes there was benefits that came from operating within that man box. So I just wanted to add that quote before I talk about that question about challenges. I would say one of our challenges was even collecting this data, and Dustin and myself and Natabhona and Alesha did different sessions with these focus groups. And this was pre-COVID, so we actually got to do them mostly in person, which was great. Sometimes we had, like when I talked about the teams, we had teams that were participants, but then this is a research study. So their coaches can't tell them, I very intentionally made it clear that their coaches can't tell them you have to participate because that's coercive. And so sometimes when we said, you all can, people can leave if they want to, sometimes people were like, yeah, I'm out. And so we had not all of the men that participated in the programs were part of the focus groups. That's always a challenge, right? When you're doing research like this, it's one of the most important things around protecting human subjects, that people don't feel like they need to be there. And Dustin and I have talked a lot about this, but especially with when you're in a system like athletics, that you have to do what your coach says, I wanted to make sure that they felt like they didn't have to participate in this part. And because for us, we want people to be real when they're present. We don't want to feel like it's another way that they have to perform. And making sure that that was really clear. The other kind of funny, haha, but not funny, was the day that we came to one campus to collect data happened to be the day that their seniors can decide. There's like one free day that the seniors call classes off for all other seniors. And it happened to be that day. And so it was like classes were canceled and we were on campus, and it was like, oh, well, like that didn't work. So those are kind of, I would say, researchy challenges that we encountered. I think from a data analyst place, that diversity that we had among the participants also made us have to kind of have caveats around our findings. So one of the findings that, Dustin, I don't know if you want to talk more about, was we had this, it's not just gender, right? It's also this intersectional social identities that shape masculine gender norms. So we had some of our groups that were based in athletic teams and some that weren't. And so trying to kind of find commonalities, but then we also had these very distinct participants that had that shaping of athletics was strong, I should say. Dustin, I don't know if you want to add more to that part.
Well, I would say going back to the challenges piece, I think the other thing too is just really figuring out and situating what your role is going to be, both in the program and in the research, is really important. So one of the things that meant was that, as it related to the KU Men's Action Project, it was really important that I was not present for the focus group, right? So as much as I would have paid money to be a fly on the wall and hear things, it's recognizing that, after 10 weeks of this program and spending this time with students, that there may be some pull for them to want to participate in it to get approval from me, right? So I knew that while I would show up at the beginning of that session to introduce them to Juliana and the other members of our research team and say, look, these are nice people, they're not scary, this is all on the up and up. But almost to a pain, I think Juliana and I are really good at getting folks to not participate in studies, because we will will be very upfront, because I think the as much as you really want to have those amazing sound bites, right? It is so important that we are not abusing the power that we have over these folks, or abusing these intimate relationships that we've built with folks. So, I think as a practitioner and a research, I had to really choose which hat I was going to wear in those spaces, while also being fortunate enough that I could conduct this research on other campuses. I also think that when you're talking about doing qualitative research and working around student schedules, there's some flexibility and some things some issues that you have to cross. So, we try to do everything in focus groups, and I really do endorse focus groups as a very viable way of engaging in this type of research. Specifically because of the ability for students to kind of build off of each other in their conversations, to complement each other, and also kind of to demonstrate the ways in which they're engaging in healthy masculinities, in the ways that they communicate and even disagree with folks in that space. And yet there are times where students couldn't show up. So there were rare occasions where we would do interviews where, maybe only one student showed up to the focus group, or student expressed interest. Well, we still want to hear from that student. But it's important that we acknowledge that there are inherent differences in how someone shows up in a focus group versus an individual interview. And so that presents a challenge, right? You may have folks disclose more about their experiences with trauma if they're in a space where they can share that alone versus sharing it with other people, right? And so that's just things to kind of think about as you're approaching this. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer to individual interviews versus focus group interviews, but it can get a little bit murky. And so I think as a research team, it's coming together talking about those, and then also thinking about as you get to the place of wanting to present this information, how you can be transparent about what challenges you experience throughout this process, and how that might show itself in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. When Dustin was talking also, it made me think, just I'll name, whenever, so I often, so like I said, my research focus is how to prevent gender-based violence, and that is focused specifically on engaging men and masculine folk in that work, not better intervention, but really thinking like men as preventionists. So I've spent a lot of time interviewing men, and I also know as a femme person, right? There is a difference of men talking to me as a researcher compared to potentially talking to Dustin, or like Adam, if you were on our team, having those conversations. We know that there's research out examining what are the complexities of having difference between interviewers and researchers, right? Or interviewees and researchers. That's real. We have to name that. And so I think that's one of the things that Natabhona and Alesha and I always were aware of when it was just femme people doing the interviewing or conducting the focus groups, or having Dustin and one of us, for example, or having Dustin. And so I think that's also something for, it's part of, no study is perfect. And I don't know if we're seeking perfection. I don't think we are. But it's one of the things we want to be mindful of, like, what does that look like? And do we code ourselves differently when we're speaking to people who we feel like, oh, you're going to get me in some way, right? That's, I think many identities potentially shape that. So I wanted to name that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate both those points. I appreciate, Juliana, you lifting up the quote, which we've actually borrowed for the title of this session, because it really does, maybe I was taught wrong all along. Then again, it's so important to capture that then again,
right?
Because there is a tension there. There is the tension of lived experience and male and masculine authorities in your life. And the point about evaluation, I'm excited to bring Dan and Grillin into this, because they actually do our program work, whether with the Men of Strength Club, our Health Masculinity Training Institute, and all of our trainings and technical assistants, because there are those dual roles, and we have to do evaluation as well and collect data. And there's a certain level of just, who does what, and how is that going to inform the information we get. To kind of close out this targeted segment on the study before we go into open-ended conversation, I want to say, and actually this is maybe a great place to jump off the open-ended conversation. In what ways do you think or hope the research you've done and continue to do might positively reshape or influence the practice of engaging men and engaging men potentially through healthy masculinity or masculinities, these kinds of men's engagement programs?
I think, when you think about a study like this, ultimately we have to generate questions to ask in the focus groups. And we did orient some of our questions towards, how do students explain or how do they define healthy masculinities and unhealthy masculinities, right? And I think what I started to kind of discover kind of midway through our interviews and through our analysis was that perhaps as a field, we have to think more beyond just binaries about healthy and unhealthy masculinities. And Adam, to your point about the title is, our students are trying to make meaning of masculine experiences that are both healthy and unhealthy at the same time, right? They're making sense of relationships that are both loving and abusive or traumatic at the same time. And so I think one of the dangers that comes with trying to prescribe a certain type of healthy masculinities, or to frame things as that they can be either healthy and good or unhealthy and toxic, is that how do we make sense of our experiences that may be positive memories, positive associations with those things that if we were to use these set definitions, others might form as harmful, right? And so how do we make meaning of experiences, and how do we do that without invalidating those experiences or other identities that might also be associated with those experiences, right? And that's really tough to think about, and it makes us kind of challenge this paradigm, right? And maybe even some of the existing paradigms that we have as it relates to how we try to make sense of masculinities, that maybe it is not, even if we talk about phases or of hegemonic masculinity, perhaps these things are not quite as rigid as we have been led to believe they are.
I want to add an additional piece, which I think this is in conversations with Dustin and other people, of even the term masculinity is like as if it's a monolith, as if it's this. And I think Dustin and I and other people, are using more, pluralizing it just as a way of pointing to the fact that there is not masculinity, there are masculinities. And I think within, I think that helps to kind of complicate the these ideas. At the same time, right? I think this is why I'm excited about this part of the conversation, is saying like, what is that conception? Like, why do we want to understand and promote healthy masculinity? And that's, I think, I look forward to hearing thoughts about that from a practice place, because I think one of the things for me, I'm not just interested in studying something as a researcher. I'm interested in how are we helping to engage in actual attitudinal and behavioral change. And that just doesn't happen, like we don't just will that to happen. Y'all are doing the work of trying to be engaged in that. And so it's like knowing where we're headed or what is our vision means that it changes the way that we get there, right? So I think that feels important as well.
Definitely. Grillo, let me go to you. I don't know. I know you don't need any prompting, but I'll offer, either your reaction to the same question. How do you hope hearing about these kinds of research findings, how do you hope they positively influence engaging men work? You're also welcome to introduce yourself and talk through how, you serve young people and all of the people that our services meet. But yeah, I'm going to turn it over to you and we'll get into this open-ended conversation, then we'll go to Dan.
Thank you, Adam. So I work with our training technical assistance department as well as our development department. And I previously worked a lot with our youth development department as well as a facilitator for our Most and Wise clubs. And so what that has meant is that I have had the opportunity to work alongside and directly with middle school, high school, and college-aged young men around these very topics of conversation around masculinities and what it looks like and what they mean. And I would say that I think my hope is for what this kind of work and research can do is sort of instill in people the importance of the consistent and continued engagement of young men and boys around these issues and having these conversations with them. I'm just thinking today about how someone reached out to me and used the word love in the conversation, and it took me aback for a second, not because I'm not used to hearing that or even from used to hearing that from men, but because of the particular individual it was. I was like, oh, something serious must be happening for this man to have used the word love in reference to the conversation we're having, right? Whereas actually I would like to normalize a world where we can just regularly talk about those kinds of feelings and sort of not be put on guard or worry that it's presaging something more serious. But I think what I see a lot in my work over the years with young men especially is this real desire for a kind of intimacy and a kind of knowing of others and of being known by others and being understood. I think there is a real sort of desire to have that be more common than it is, not even just amongst close friends, but as a part of larger friend groups, as a part of community, to know that you can be vulnerable in those moments and that vulnerability won't be exploited because you said something that was off code, or that you said something that you as a man or as a boy shouldn't say, right? That you can feel comfortable being all kinds of versions of yourself, and that those versions will be validated by the people around you.
Well, and to piggyback off of that, Reelan, I think we found that in our research too. When we asked folks to talk about healthy masculinities, one of the kind of main themes that came from that was that healthy masculinities to many of our participants was about this idea of self-authorship or of an ability to be comfortable in your own skin, to know who you are, to be able to be at ease or to be vulnerable with other folks. And so that was something that was consistent that came across in many of the focus groups that we did with folks, is that, and it was aspirational, because it didn't seem that any of them had, like, that they had achieved it, right? That they were so comfortable in their masculinities as to suggest that they fully felt themselves, but this was something that they were hoping to achieve, right? Was to reach this level of comfort, which really did not come across as something that they felt that they were experiencing in this moment, but potentially now felt like they were on a pathway where they could be that and be surrounded by folks who would appreciate them for that.
Dan, I'll make some space for you here. Thoughts, reactions?
Yeah, what Grillen said, and then thank you, Dustin and Juliana, first and foremost. Just it's giving me a lot right now, but this conversation is definitely needed, of course, and that's why we're having it. But to what you all are saying, that is my hope for our young people, specifically when we talk about healthy masculinity. On the practice level, I did this yesterday, walk into a room with high school age young men and say, for as many different people as you see in this room, I got this from our executive director, Neil Irvin, for as many different people you see in this room, there are that many different masculinities. We all have a different definition of that, right? Our goal here in this space, in the Men of Strength Club, is to figure out what that is for ourselves, to understand fully our authentic selves, to live in the counter story and know that love is at the center of it. And then to do that, express that freely, right? Have the freedom to be vulnerable with our peers and all of these things and not cause harm to others or ourselves, right? I always have to be very specific about that last piece. Is you can be whoever you are and enjoy that and express that freely and all of these things. But at the end of the day, harm, we have to mitigate. We have to eliminate all of these. We have to be positive and really contribute to the growth of those around us. So that's why I'm excited to dig into the rest of the conversation, because I feel like we're on the same page. And my hope is, the science continues to back up what I experience on a day-to-day basis, and we can really get to that place where all people can be the full expression of themselves.
Let me ask this, pointedly. I think we're getting there, but let me ask the point, because we've got theory, practice, and research all in the same room. To the Mixer team, our trainings, our services, our products, our programs, our youth development programs, they reach thousands of men over the course of 25 years, and young men, and many who fall within the demographics of this research study, right? Men on college campuses, but plenty who fall outside of that. I'm curious if, as you digested the conversation, if there were themes that sound similar to what we might hear in an HMTI, Healthy Masculinity Training Institute, or in a Men of Strength Club, which works specifically in DC here with high school students, many of whom are seniors who are right on the precipice, right, of entering the college experience. Just curious if there were themes that emerged that felt familiar, or that felt distinct, or that think really add to the conversation, everything we're exploring right now.
Well, I think the challenge of getting 15 to 20 men in a room and getting them all to talk about this issue, whether it's for the sake of a focus group or even just for a most club, felt to me like a pretty relatable experience. If anyone who's ever had to try and get any group off the ground knows, it's certainly not easy. But what I also heard, particularly in the quote that Juliana read off, is a lot of what our young people talk about, not just our college-age men, but these are some of the thoughts that even our high school and middle school young men and boys are having too, around this question of, what have I been taught, and what are the things that I've been taught that I should, continue to take with me as valuable, which are the ones that I should maybe discard or rethink because they're not as valuable as I've maybe been led to believe. I think there's that really intense friction between, wanting to honor how you've been raised and what you've been taught to believe, versus sort of coming into a new awareness of the world around you and how a lot of what you've taught maybe doesn't make sense or isn't reflected in what you're seeing, and sort of having to adjust what you believe based on, how you're living.
Well, and I think part of how that relates to our work is, we kind of explored the interactions between social identities, particularly race and ethnicity, and their experiences making sense of masculinities. And particularly for our men of color, and I'd say more pointedly towards our young Black men who were participants in this, there really was, you could sense a struggle with trying to make sense of how to perform masculinities in varied spaces, right? And particularly contextualizing that this is happening in the Midwest at predominantly white institutions, and that for many of these students, they're leaving spaces that they're environments that they're very accustomed to. They're moving from more urban centers or moving away from largely Black populations, where in high school, they might have be given that hard time for the way that they perform masculinity in a certain way because it wasn't tough enough, it wasn't strong enough, it wasn't performing a certain way, only to arrive at a PWI campus and then to be told that they're not Black enough and they're not performing their Black masculinities in a certain type of way. And so they really are constantly experiencing this tension about, how am I supposed to show up? What does that mean in my interactions with other men? What does that mean in my interactions with other women, right? And so it's not just making sense of masculinities, but it's also making sense of white supremacy, right? And navigating a PWI in a space that is very different, and seemingly feeling that no matter how you're performing it, you're wrong, right? You're wrong for performing it a certain way in high school. You're wrong for performing it a certain way in the classroom. You're wrong for performing it a certain way in social settings in the weekends. And then that doesn't even explain the experience for student athletes and that identity and how that might change how they have to juggle, or as our students would talk about, turning it on and off, almost like a light switch, how they would perform their masculinities in different settings.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. And that makes me think back to conversations that we've had both in our own offices, in our trainings, as well as with our young men, about sort of the fundamental, like, it's like a game you can't win, right? And it's designed to be unwinnable because they want you to keep playing. So when you keep playing, you keep policing other people's masculinities, you keep policing your own masculinities, you keep trying to meet this rubric. And so if you were ever actually satisfied, you might stop playing the game. So you can't be satisfied. So because we need this whole masculinity thing to keep going. So we need more and more people to be unsure and to be questioning so that they continue to question others. It's strange in a sense because we all sort of move as if there are people who have the final say on masculinity, but it feels like everyone in a sense is kind of making it up as they go along, and they're kind of assuming that the person next to them has the answers when really no one has the concrete answer.
And the goalpost is always moving.
I love this part of the conversation because with some other colleagues, I'm working on a paper that again is all masculine folk. Sorry, I'm going to jump studies just for a second. But looking at that relationship between how do we perceive, so say men, how do men perceive what other men believe is masculine? And then how does that influence the way that they think about their own masculinity? So we think about that like our, social norms, but in this study, we're really looking at like who matters. Is it if you have a romantic partner, is it that person's perceptions of masculinity? We've given a lot of credit to peers, and our study is actually looking at, are peers as powerful as we think they are? And does it really matter about where they are developmentally, right? Does that change in our developmental cycle? So I love that we're talking about this because I think that idea of, do we do it to do men do it to themselves? Do they perform it on others? And then what's that relationship between what do I have in my head that keeps getting moved and what do other people keep doing to in their own heads, and what is our perception of each other? It's complicated. That I think that's one of the things I'm hearing from you all. It's not like we understand it all. We're still trying to unpack it. And that's, to me, as in my researcher hat, is like, I'm trying to understand that to be able to give that back to the practice community, to be like, if we're trying to be effective at supporting promoting this idea of healthy masculinities. How do we do that? Based on what we know, how people are perceiving things.
What I appreciate about all of that, and going specifically back to something Greerlin said is, we've seen that for all of this, for all that's traditional and performative, things that we roll up to thematically at McIntyre, it's like the dominant story. Like for all of the dominant story of masculinity, you can approach in these settings at the right moment, someone as young as middle school, but our high school work, and there is that tension point is already there. For as much as is being subscribed to in the dominant story, there's still that openness and willingness to think about what could be discarded, but also that tension point of, maybe I was taught wrong all along. Then again, so that resonated for me, because there is that propulsion, right? There is that game that we're all playing, but when the room gets quiet, is there that moment to really interrogate what might be discarded and what's going to be kept, and the reasons for why those choices have to be made, and the overlapping intersectionalities and contexts that inform a decision that any young person and grown person makes.
And thank you, Adam, because what you just said made me think of something I wanted to mention earlier in response to Dustin, and how, masculinity, specifically Black masculinity, may show up, may not, in a certain setting. Where I'm from South Carolina originally, and I know that Black masculinity looks different there even than it does here in the district, right? But it's what I notice, especially here, but a lot of other places, it's a safety issue as well, right? The dominant story of masculinity, all of these things, in a lot of situations are adapted, or these behaviors are adapted in order to, survive in a certain setting. So what does it mean to unlearn what has been a survival tactic for me all of these years? You know what I mean? And to really hear from someone else, from a professional or an academic, that what I've learned for survival is causing harm to other people potentially, right? And that then breeds a larger conversation that I feel the framework of dominant and counter stories does lend itself to. So I just wanted to offer that for the space as well. Thank you, Adam. Yeah,
Dan, when you were saying that, I was thinking back to something Juliana said about sort of our perceptions of our peers in terms of what they think masculinity is and what we think they think our masculinity looks like. But I'm also thinking of, to your point about potential harm, right? There are tangible positives and negatives, to this thing called masculinity, right? And how we show up with it, whether it's in an office space or whether we're applying for a job or you're applying for a home. It happens in your sort of intimate relationships with partners, with friends, with family, right? So there are like actual consequences to not showing up with a particular kind of masculinity. And you may even be aware of the kind of masculinity that's being asked of you, and you may not necessarily respect the ask that's being made of you, but you need to meet these demands because that's what's going to get you this job. That's what's going to get you to safety. That's what's going to, continue to maintain these relationships. So I think there's also a level of, an emotional awareness in men and masculine folks where they're sort of aware that this isn't quite fair, or they're aware that this isn't quite what they personally believe to be what masculinity is, but they have to play that game in that moment to get from point A to point B.
Oh, I love that point. And I'm thinking, I'm sorry, I keep bringing in other studies. I did a study that looked at, we actually asked women that were in relationship to men and the men themselves to talk, and it was a fatherhood program. And it was looking at a quote, I like quotes, a mom saying, I don't want my partner to be an ATM. I want him to be a dad. And that naming of, like, I think the expectation, right, that men are going to be financial providers, and this idea of like, that's a role that, like you were saying, that maybe they don't want to take that on, but they feel like they have to for whatever reason. And that the woman's response of saying like, I don't want this. I don't want this idea of the way that this man thinks that he needs to perform. I want him to be a father. And I won't get into what that meant, but it's this idea of, like you were saying about relationship, of us having emotional awareness of what is it that we're asking of each other, and what is it that we're that we feel like we can be, right? And that we want to give each other. And I think that's one of the things that Dustin and Anthony will maybe talk about next week, is this idea of emotional intelligence, that being a component of us trying to unpack this whole, what does this idea of being a man mean, right? Of having this opportunity to know oneself and also to engage with others, of what are the consequences of me acting in a particular way, or my beliefs, how does that impact my relationships to others, and to be able to ask for what you need too in the midst of that. So
Adam, can I ask a question here? I know this is an open-ended.
No, you absolutely can. The only thing I will say is that, again, this is an engaging conversation. So those of you watching, we want to hear your thoughts. That's #MCSR series. And again, join us on Monday at 2:30 to hear more about this and ask your questions live. But Breland, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm loving this conversation, but one of the things that I feel like I regularly encounter when doing this work is sort of the so what question, right? So at the beginning, we framed this around the idea that there was a possible connection between masculinity and particularly unhealthy masculinities and violence, right? And so the idea of this conversation being at least in part about additional avenues for violence prevention, or for making men into preventionists. So my question then is, what is the connection between unhealthy and healthy masculinity and violence prevention?
it's a doozy. I love that question, because I think it does get at this whole, what is the relationship that we, and for me, it's where can we intervene in thinking about that. I would say for me, and I would say theoretically, that feels like we need to have a whole other conversation, but I'll try to say a little bit of how I think about it right now. In this idea that Dustin named this before about gender transformative programs, and it to me, it feels like, just from listening to how you all are talking about this, that is how Men Can Stop Rape is thinking about their work, right? Is we becoming aware of what we're doing and how we think about gender will lead, this is the belief, right, that will lead to us thinking about our impact on other people differently. And I think this scholarship helps us think we can watch how being involved in ongoing relationship with other men in a context like this helps people be able to move in their thinking, helps people be able to understand themselves differently than they did when they began. And Dustin and I are very careful, and our colleagues are very careful to be like, we didn't do a pre-test, post-test, right? That's not what we're doing. Not yet. But from their descriptions of their experience, that's partially what we'll see. What we didn't talk about today, and this is the Dustin saying there's more to say. Some of the questions that we asked at the end of our focus group is, what do you see your role as being in preventing gender-based violence, or preventing sexual violence particularly? And hearing the men then talk about what their ideas are of how they're going to be involved. What are they going to do? And that could be in their relationships with potential children that they might have, partners that they might have in the future. Some of them currently thinking about policy level change, thinking about parental leave taking and trying to think about how to expand that. Them thinking about being mentors in unique ways. So I think to me, it's that process, which to me is like this, right? It isn't a A to B, but it is a process of understanding. And I think, to our point specifically about men's own experiences of trauma and violence that they have experienced themselves as children, I think this is part of that whole understanding their, and this is related to my fatherhood work as well, is like naming what happened for them as kids changes how they think about being adults and parenting themselves, right? But that is to me, that feels like a very relational, a relational path. That's my 5-minute thinking about this. I'd love to hear other people's responses to that. Dustin, if you want to lean in here too.
I'll add this quickly, but I think beyond asking questions as researchers around how they define healthy masculinities and unhealthy masculinities, I think it's also asking participants questions that help them kind of interrogate what their relationship is to anti-sexist work, right? And thus, what does that mean for their commitments, right? As much as I would like to say that as a result of participating in this program, every participant is going to leave as a intersectional feminist and is going to engage in nonprofit or NGO work related to this, some of them are just going to be teachers. And that's pretty great, because that means the work that they're doing in a K through 12 setting is going to be potentially transformative for some other folks. Other folks are going to take a job in a nice business office, right? But that they might be the folks that are the first to advocate for paid parental leave, right? Or updating our discrimination policies, or things like that. So I think one of the challenges is often when we think about the action that we're wanting to come from this, is it is so much tethered to the other identities these folks have, and what their level of understanding and commitment were to these concepts prior to joining the programs, right? So that's going to look different from the participant who is voluntold that they have to show up, thought they were going to hate it, and then by the end really enjoyed it, versus the person that's been, beating down your door for weeks to figure out when the first session is going to start, and already has a whole number of Bell Hooks readings or Audre Lorde readings that they want to disseminate out to the groups. And so the challenge with these programs and for the researchers assessing or understanding them is that there's not a fixity in where folks are coming into this work, and thus the commitment is not there. But I think trying to understand the commitment, not in terms of what their feminist identities are, their social justice identities, but really what their relationship is to anti-sexism, right? And how that relates to healthy masculinities and relates to where they're going to move forward from here, I think is something that is really important, that is not just in the curriculum, but is a part of the way in which we're framing or asking some of these questions, so that the participants can really interrogate, like, what does it mean to be anti-sexist for me, right? Am I fully divesting myself from all things deemed as toxic masculinity, right? Or am I merely intervening when my friend makes a sexist, homophobic, transphobic joke, right? We can place values on all of those things, but it's really probably more important that we understand the value that the participant is putting on those behaviors.
I appreciate that point, Dustin, because if it hasn't been mentioned already, myself and Greeland are alum of our Men of Strength Club. And so, sure, we're back at the organization, our different capacities, beating this drum, but we have colleagues who were sitting in those circles with us who, or former friends and peers who are now teachers, who are now NGOs, who are now in all these ripple effects of different settings, who get to take, in theory, those lessons with them, and ultimately move the conversation forward. So I have one more question, but in the interest of time, I'm going to make it open-ended for all of you who are tuning in today. And I'm going to go right back to the prompt, which was, again, rigid masculine gender norms have been identified as a significant driver of sexual violence. And to prevent and reduce sexual violence perpetration, some colleges and universities have developed men's engagement programs. So as Greeland said, so what? Or as I'll say, looking ahead to what's still unknown in researching engagement programs for college men, I'm interested to hear from all of you tuning in. What might you hope to learn next? Where do you think we should go from here? So that's hashtag MCSR series. You can bring your response into the conversation on Monday, 2:30 Eastern, where we'll pick things up with Dan as well, and Dustin and Anthony, to talk about the Men's Action Project and how scholarship, evaluation, and so much other good stuff might inform how these programs are run. I want to thank Dustin, Juliana, Dan, and Greerlin for a wonderful conversation and their time. If you enjoyed this conversation, we invite you to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's more good stuff coming. To be kept in the loop about these kinds of events and so much more, you can subscribe to our email list at mcsr.org/sign-up. I'd be remiss not to add that it is our 25th anniversary year. We're very proud of that. So to learn more about all of that, including an essay on 7 lessons we've learned in the last 25 years and where we hope to go forward, you can visit mcsr.org/25 years. And that Healthy Masculinity Training Institute I've been talking about, yep, there's one coming up on April 20th. So you can learn more about that at mcsr.org/shop. I promise that's the last URL I will read out to you. So please don't forget to join us on Monday at 2:30 Eastern to continue the conversation, including your live Q&A. Thanks for tuning in, and take care.